Moscow, 2026, 12 million people, and every single one of them has figured out how to live here, how to make the numbers work, how to find the balance between what the city costs and what the city gives back. I ride through this city every day. I see the people who have solved the equation and the people who are still working on it. Today, I am going to show you what the equation actually looks like. Not the version that appears on expat websites, not the version that appears in government statistics, the version that exists on these streets, in these apartments, in these kitchens where real people are making real decisions about real money every single day. The first thing you need to understand about the cost of living in Moscow is that the city is not one city economically. It is several cities layered on top of each other occupying the same geographic space, but operating according to completely different financial realities. The Moscow of the central districts where the beautiful architecture is and the expensive restaurants are and the streets look like what a wealthy European city is supposed to look like is a real Moscow. But it is the Moscow of a minority. The Moscow where most of the 12 million people actually live is the Moscow of the outer districts. The Moscow of Butovo and Zelenograd and Lyubertsy and Kotelniki and dozens of other neighborhoods that tourists never visit and that form the actual fabric of daily life in this city. The cost of living in these two Moscows is so different that quoting a single average figure for the city is essentially meaningless. It tells you something about the mathematics and nothing about the reality. Housing is where everything starts. It is the number that determines what everything else looks like. In the central districts, a one-bedroom apartment rents for between 80,000 and 150,000 rubles per month, between $900 and $1,700. To buy in the central districts, you spend between 15 and 30 million rubles, between $170,000 and $330,000. These are prices that most Muscovites cannot pay. They are not the prices of ordinary Moscow life. They are the prices of a specific and relatively small slice of Moscow life that gets disproportionate attention because it is the slice that visitors see and that photographs well. In the outer districts where I work and where most Muscovites live, the numbers are completely different. A one-bedroom apartment rents for between 35,000 and 55,000 rubles per month, between $400 and $600. A two-bedroom apartment, which in Moscow terms means something closer to what Americans would call a one-bedroom, because the rooms are smaller and the layouts are different, rents for between 45,000 and 70,000 rubles, between $500 and $800. To buy in the outer districts, you spend between 4 and 8 million rubles, between $45,000 and $90,000. These are real numbers. Numbers that real people in real outer district Moscow pay for real housing. Not luxurious numbers, not aspirational numbers, the numbers of a life that works. There is a third housing reality that most discussions of Moscow costs ignore entirely, and that is in many ways the most important one for understanding how this city actually functions economically. A very significant portion of Moscow's population lives in apartments that cost them nothing in rent or mortgage because those apartments were inherited. The Soviet state built an enormous quantity of housing and assigned it to working people based on their employment unit and their rank within it and their family size. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian government in the early 1990s transferred ownership of those apartments to the people who lived in them for free. Those people are now in their 60s and 70s and 80s. When they die, their children inherit. When those children die, their children inherit. The result is a Moscow where a substantial portion of the population has solved the housing problem completely through an inheritance that has nothing to do with their own income or savings or financial choices. For these people, the cost of housing in Moscow is zero. Or rather, it is the cost of utilities and maintenance and the various fees that come with apartment ownership. Which brings us to utilities. Utilities in Moscow are subsidized by the state in ways that produce numbers that people from Western countries consistently find impossible to believe until they check them multiple times and confirm that they are real. The central heating that runs through the radiators of Soviet-era Moscow apartment buildings, and that is the difference between comfortable and very uncomfortable during a genuine Moscow winter, does not work the way heating works in Western countries. There is no thermostat, there is no individual control. Heat comes from a central district heating plant that serves entire neighborhoods, and it is billed at a flat rate based on the square footage of the apartment. For a standard apartment of 50 to 60 square meters, the monthly heating bill runs between 2,000 and 4,000 rubles, between $22 and $44 per month, for genuine heat through a genuine Moscow winter. Water is similarly priced. A standard monthly water bill for a Moscow apartment runs between 500 and 1,500 rubles, between $6 and $17. Electricity runs between 900 and 1,500 rubles per month, between $10 and $17. Internet, which in Moscow is genuinely fast with fiber connections running at 100 megabits or faster, costs between 400 and 700 rubles per month, between $4 and $8. The total monthly utility bill for a standard Moscow apartment, including all of these categories, runs between 5,000 and 8,000 rubles, between $55 and $90. This is the number that stops conversations. $55 to $90 a month for all utilities, including heat in a city where winter is real and long and cold. Food costs in Moscow in 2026 reflect a market that has adapted significantly to the changes of recent years. The departure of many Western food brands has been replaced by domestic alternatives and imports from countries that maintained commercial relationships with Russia. The practical effect for the Moscow consumer is a food market that is somewhat different in its brand composition than it was several years ago, but that continues to provide access to a wide range of products at prices that are low by the standards of comparable European cities. A kilogram of bread costs between 80 and 120 rubles. A liter of milk costs between 70 and 100 rubles. A dozen eggs costs between 120 and 180 rubles. A kilogram of chicken costs between 250 and 350 rubles. A kilogram of potatoes costs between 40 and 70 rubles. These are the prices in a standard Moscow supermarket. Not a discount supermarket and not a premium supermarket. A standard chain supermarket of the kind that exists on every major street in every Moscow district. A typical Moscow family of 3 cooking most of their meals at home spends between 15,000 and 25,000 rubles per month on groceries, between $165 and $275. This is the real food cost for real home cooking in Moscow in 2026. Transportation is the category where Moscow most dramatically outperforms cities of comparable size and importance in the Western world. The Moscow metro is the backbone of how this city moves, and it moves at a price that makes public transit in Western European or North American cities look like a luxury product by comparison. A single metro ride using a Troika card costs 46 rubles, approximately 50 cents. A monthly unlimited pass that covers the metro, the Moscow Central Circle, the central diameters, and most city buses costs 2,800 rubles, $31. For $31, you have unlimited access to a transit system that runs from 5:30 in the morning until 1 in the morning, that during peak hours delivers trains every 90 seconds on the busiest lines, that is clean and safe, and in many of its stations genuinely beautiful, in ways that transit systems in other world cities simply are not. The Moscow metro is not a compromise. It is not the option you take when you cannot afford a car. It is a genuinely good way to move through a large city, and the price of unlimited monthly access to it is $31. For Muscovites who drive, the calculation is more complicated. Fuel costs approximately 60 rubles per liter. Car insurance for a standard vehicle runs between 15,000 and 40,000 rubles per year. Central Moscow has introduced paid parking in large areas of the city, and the cost of parking adds meaningfully to the total cost of car ownership for people who work or regularly travel in these areas. The traffic congestion in Moscow is real and significant. The city has invested heavily in road infrastructure over the past decade, but 12 million people, and one of the highest rates of car ownership among major European cities, produce congestion that costs time that has real economic value, even when it is difficult to quantify. Most car-owning Muscovites also maintain metro passes and use the metro when it is the faster option. The total monthly transportation cost for a car-owning Muscovite in an outer district who also uses the metro runs between 5,000 and 15,000 rubles per month, between $55 and $165. Healthcare costs in Moscow exist in the space between a genuinely free state system and a genuinely accessible private system. The state system, the compulsory medical insurance system known as OMS, covers every Russian citizen and provides access to polyclinics and hospitals at no direct cost at the point of service. Every employed person contributes to this system through payroll deductions. The system is real and functional in ways that vary by institution. Some Moscow polyclinics provide genuinely good care. Others provide adequate care. The waiting times for specialist appointments can be significant. This is the trade-off of a free system serving a large population with finite resources. The private healthcare sector fills the gaps. A consultation with a general practitioner at a private clinic costs between 1,500 and 3,000 rubles, between $16 and $33. A specialist consultation costs between 2,000 and 5,000 rubles, between $22 and $55. A blood panel at a private laboratory costs between 2,000 and 4,000 rubles, between $22 and $44. An MRI costs between 4,000 and 8,000 rubles, between $44 and $88. A dental cleaning costs between 1,500 and 3,000 rubles, between $16 and $33. A dental filling costs between 2,000 and 5,000 rubles, between $22 and $55. These prices are real. They are the prices that actual private medical facilities in Moscow charge in 2026. The reaction of Americans who encounter these numbers for the first time is consistent and predictable. Disbelief followed by verification, followed by a complicated set of feelings about the American healthcare system that I will leave each viewer to work through on their own. The food away from home calculation matters for understanding the full picture of what Moscow costs. A business lunch at a standard Moscow cafe including soup, main course, salad, and a drink costs between 300 and 500 rubles, between 330 and 550. This is the price of a real cooked meal at a real restaurant with table service in Moscow. A coffee at a standard cafe costs between 250 and 400 rubles, between 275 and 440. A beer at a standard bar costs between 200 and 400 rubles, between 220 and 440. A dinner for two at a mid-range Moscow restaurant with starters, main courses, and drinks costs between 3,000 and 6,000 rubles, between $33 and $66. The typical Muscovite who eats out regularly and drinks coffee outside the home several times a week spends between 10,000 and 20,000 rubles per month on this category, between $110 and $220. Entertainment and culture in Moscow are accessible at price points that reflect a city that has invested in public cultural infrastructure over decades, and that continues to maintain that infrastructure in ways that keep it genuinely available to the full range of the population, rather than only to those who can afford premium prices. A cinema ticket costs between 300 and 800 rubles, between 330 and 880. A museum admission at most of the major Moscow museums costs between 300 and 1,000 rubles. A theater ticket at a standard Moscow theater costs between 1,000 and 5,000 rubles, between $11 and $55. The Bolshoi Theater is more expensive, with tickets ranging from 500 rubles in the upper tiers to 15,000 rubles for premium seats at popular performances. But the Bolshoi is not the only option. Moscow has dozens of theaters offering performances of genuine quality at prices that ordinary working people can access. The free cultural infrastructure of the city is also extensive. The parks are free and beautiful and genuinely used by enormous numbers of people at all hours. The outdoor fitness equipment installed throughout the park system is free. The public ice skating rinks that operate in winter are free or nominally priced. The public concerts and outdoor cinema screenings and seasonal festivals that the city government organizes throughout the year are free. A Muscovite who uses this free and low-cost cultural infrastructure has access to a genuinely rich cultural life at minimal cost. Clothing and personal care costs in Moscow reflect a market that has adapted to significant changes in the availability of Western brands. A pair of jeans costs between 3,000 and 8,000 rubles, between $33 and $88. A winter coat costs between 5,000 and 20,000 rubles, between $55 and $220. A gym membership at a standard outer district fitness club costs between 2,000 and 4,000 rubles per month, between $22 and $44. A haircut costs between 500 and 1,500 rubles, between $550 and $1,650. A Muscovite who dresses adequately for professional and social life without making fashion a priority spends between 30,000 and 60,000 rubles per year on clothing and personal care combined, between $330 and $660 annually. The complete picture. When you add up everything across all the categories, the cost of living in Moscow in 2026 resolves into three distinct financial realities depending on where you sit in relation to the housing question. Let me walk you through each one specifically because the differences between them are so large that they essentially describe three different cities existing in the same geographic space. The first reality is the reality of the housing owner. The person who inherited their apartment, or who paid it off years ago and who now lives in Moscow without a rent payment or a mortgage payment hanging over every financial decision they make. This person's monthly expenses look like this. Utilities for a standard apartment run between 5,000 and 8,000 rubles per month, between $55 and $88. Food cooked primarily at home with occasional cafe visits runs between 15,000 and 25,000 rubles, between $165 and $275. A monthly metro pass costs 2,800 rubles, $31. Healthcare through the state system with occasional private supplements runs between 0 and 5,000 rubles per month on average. Clothing and personal care averaged over the year runs between 3,000 and 6,000 rubles per month. Entertainment and cultural life using a mix of free public options and paid options runs between 3,000 and 8,000 rubles per month. The total for this person runs between 28,800 and 57,800 rubles per month, between $317 and $636. This is what a real Moscow life costs when the housing question is solved. $300 to $600 a month for food and warmth and transport and health care and culture in one of the world's great cities. This number is not a mistake. It is not a low estimate designed to make Moscow look cheap. It is the actual arithmetic of actual expenses for a person who owns their housing in Moscow in 2026. The reason it sounds impossible to people from Western countries is that in Western countries the housing question is almost never solved this completely. Rent or mortgage payments dominate the budgets of most urban residents in Western cities in ways that simply do not apply to the portion of Moscow's population that inherited Soviet-era housing. That portion is large. It is one of the most economically significant facts about Moscow that most outside observers miss entirely. The second reality is the reality of the renting professional. The young person who came to Moscow for work or education or opportunity and who is navigating the city's housing market without the benefit of inherited property. This person earns between 60,000 and 120,000 rubles per month in a standard professional job, between $660 and $1,320. Their monthly expenses look like this. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment in an outer district runs between 35,000 and 55,000 rubles, between $385 and $605. Utilities on top of rent run between 5,000 and 8,000 rubles. Food with a mix of home cooking and the cafe visits that are part of professional social life runs between 20,000 and 35,000 rubles. Transportation runs between 3,000 and 6,000 rubles. Healthcare runs between 2,000 and 5,000 rubles. Clothing and personal care at a professional level runs between 5,000 and 10,000 rubles per month, averaged over the year. Entertainment and social life at the level appropriate for a young professional in a major city runs between 8,000 and 15,000 rubles. The total runs between 78,000 and 134,000 rubles per month, between $858 and $1,474. Against a salary of 60,000 to 120,000 rubles. This means that at the lower end of the salary range, the budget is extremely tight with almost no room for saving or unexpected expenses. At the higher end of the salary range, there is genuine room to save and to build toward the goal that dominates the financial thinking of most renting Muscovites, which is accumulating enough for a down payment on their own apartment. How long this takes depends on the specific numbers, but at the higher professional salary levels with disciplined saving, it is a goal that is achievable over a period of years rather than decades. This is the financial reality of being a renting young professional in Moscow. It is not easy. It is not comfortable in the way that the housing owner's reality is comfortable, but it is livable and it has a trajectory. The trajectory is toward the first reality, toward solved housing, toward the financial freedom that comes from not paying rent every month for the rest of your working life. The third reality is the reality of the flexible worker, the courier, the gig economy participant, the person who has chosen or been forced into a working arrangement that provides flexibility and independence at the cost of income stability and income level. My reality. I earn between 20,000 and 40,000 rubles per month, depending on how many hours I choose to work and how efficiently I manage my routes. Between $220 and $440. This is not a high income by any Moscow standard. It is a specific choice about the relationship between time and money that makes sense for specific people in specific circumstances, and that does not make sense for others. The monthly expenses for this life depend entirely on the housing situation. If the housing is solved through inheritance or family arrangement, the expenses look like this. Food cooked almost entirely at home runs between 10,000 and 15,000 rubles. Transportation costs for bike maintenance run between 1,000 and 2,000 rubles. Healthcare through the state system runs between 0 and 2,000 rubles. Clothing and personal care at a basic functional level runs between 2,000 and 4,000 rubles averaged over the year. Entertainment at the free and low-cost end of what Moscow offers runs between 1,000 and 3,000 rubles. Total expenses with solved housing run between 14,000 and 26,000 rubles per month, between $154 and $286. Against an income of 20,000 to 40,000 rubles, this leaves between 6,000 and 14,000 rubles per month after covering all expenses, between $66 and $154. This is modest. It is not comfortable saving. It is the financial reality of a flexible, low-intensity working life in a major city when the fundamental question of housing has been answered by someone else. It works. It does not work spectacularly, but it works. If the housing has not been solved, the same income does not cover rent plus expenses at any reasonable outer district rental price, and the flexible working arrangement needs to be supplemented by other income, or the housing question needs to be solved through shared arrangements or family support. This is the constraint that determines whether the flexible working life is viable in Moscow, not the cost of food or transport or healthcare or entertainment. Those costs are manageable. It is always and only the housing that determines whether a given income level produces a life that works in this city. What all three of these realities share, and what I think is the most important thing to understand about the cost of living in Moscow in 2026, is this. The basic necessities of a human life in this city are genuinely affordable in ways that are not true of comparable cities in Western Europe or North America. Heat, food, transport, healthcare, education, culture. These things cost money in Moscow, but they cost significantly less money than they cost in London or Paris or New York or Toronto. The subsidy of Soviet-era infrastructure investment persists in utilities. The scale of the city drives down the cost of transport. The competition in the food market keeps grocery prices reasonable. The parallel existence of a free state healthcare system and an accessible private system provides healthcare at price points that Americans find impossible to believe. The investment in public cultural infrastructure keeps theater and museum and outdoor cultural life genuinely accessible. These are the structural facts of what Moscow costs. They are the result of decades of specific decisions about how to build a city and what to make available to the people who live in it. They do not resolve all the difficulties of Moscow life, but they provide a foundation that is more solid than the average outside observer assumes. The inequality is real, and it matters. The person who inherited a central Moscow apartment and the person who is renting in Butovo are both Muscovites. They ride the same metro. They have access to the same museums and parks. They eat in some of the same restaurants. But their financial situations are separated by a gulf that the inheritance of Soviet-era housing allocation created, and that the market economy of the past 3 decades has widened rather than narrowed. This is the central economic tension of Moscow life in 2026. The city provides an affordable foundation for basic needs. But the housing market sits on top of that foundation in a way that distributes its affordability very unevenly. The people who inherited well live affordable Moscow lives. The people who did not inherit it well work much harder for the same result. And the people who arrived in Moscow without any inheritance at all face a housing market that absorbs a very large fraction of their income, and that makes building toward ownership a project measured in years of disciplined sacrifice, rather than in comfortable accumulation. I ride through all of this every day. I see it from my bike in the specific way that you see a city when you are moving through it at the pace of a bicycle, rather than the pace of a car or the pace of a metro train. You see the grandmother on the bench outside the building she has lived in for 50 years, and that she owns because the Soviet state gave it to her parents, and her parents gave it to her. You see the young couple walking together with the specific tension of people who are calculating something difficult. You see the construction site where another apartment building is going up that will eventually house people who are currently in that calculating stage. You see all of this and you understand that the cost of living in Moscow is not a number. It is a situation. A situation that is different for every one of the 12 million people navigating it. A situation that is shaped by history and inheritance and choice and luck, in proportions that vary from person to person, and that produce lives that are as varied as the city itself. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing it. Come back next week and leave me a comment. What surprised you most about these numbers? I read every single one.